I never thought I'd inherit a ranch. Honestly, my life was a quiet one, coffee in the morning, emails at work, and the occasional weekend Netflix binge. But then came the call. "Hello," I said, expecting a telemarketer. "Is this your name? I'm calling from the law office of Green and Associates. Your great-uncle has passed, and you're his heir. You now own Silver Creek Ranch." I laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because I had no idea what to do with a ranch. Me, I couldn't even keep a cactus alive. The lawyer's voice continued, but I barely heard a word. Ranch, heir, property. My mind was spinning faster than a tractor in a mud puddle. By the end of the call, I was the proud owner of 300 acres, a broken barn, a pond full of who knows what, and as I would soon find out, a homeowners association that had apparently declared war on anyone who dared call this place home. It all started with a single envelope, the kind of envelope that makes your stomach drop before your eyes even read the first line. Inside was a letter from the Silver Creek HOA. Bold letters screamed, "Notice of fines and violations, $120,000 due immediately." I blinked once, twice, 3 times, then I laughed because what else could I do? $120,000. For what exactly? Not paying a late fee, planting the wrong flower, letting the cows look at the neighbors wrong. The letter went on. Violation 1, unauthorized modification of landscaping. Violation 2, failure to maintain fence standards. Violation 3, allowing wildlife to roam freely. I stared at my ceiling, imagining the HOA board members in a dark room, rubbing their hands like cartoon villains, counting their imaginary fines. I couldn't even keep the goats fed properly, let alone modify anything. And yet, apparently, I had broken every unwritten law on Silver Creek Ranch. I decided to take a tour of my new kingdom. The barn smelled like old hay and regrets. The pond was murky, hiding secrets, or maybe just frogs plotting their escape. The fences leaned like they were tired of standing. And yet, amidst all the chaos, I felt a spark of excitement. Maybe this ranch wasn't a burden. Maybe it was a challenge. Maybe I could actually do this. Then I heard a sound that froze my blood. A distant crunching, footsteps. Or was it the HOA already patrolling? My imagination ran wild. I pictured the board members storming the property with clipboards, hard hats, and an army of lawyers, ready to demand every last penny. I laughed nervously. "Okay, universe," I muttered, "I see your game." That night I sat on the porch, staring at the stars, trying to process the absurdity of it all. A ranch I didn't ask for, $120,000 in phantom fines, an HOA that apparently had a personal vendetta against me. And yet there was a strange thrill in it, because if I could survive this, maybe, just maybe, I could actually claim this place as mine. I didn't know it yet, but the real fight was about to begin. Not with cows, not with fences, not even with the weather, but with the people who thought they could control my life from their polished boardroom. And I promise you, they had no idea who they were messing with. As I folded the letter and set it on the kitchen counter, a thought crossed my mind. $120,000? Sure, they clearly picked the wrong owner to bully. I went to bed that night, sleep elusive, mind racing. This ranch had a story, and I had just stepped into the first page. Little did I know this was only the beginning. By morning, the HOA would try to make me their latest victim, and I would be ready to fight back. The next morning, I was wide awake at 6 a.m. Too much adrenaline, too much worry, and maybe a little too much caffeine. The sun was just rising over the sprawling fields of Silver Creek Ranch, casting long shadows over the crooked fences and dusty barn. Somehow, it all looked even more intimidating in the morning light. And that's when it hit me. The HOA wasn't going to wait. They weren't just sending letters. No, they wanted a face-to-face confrontation. Apparently, I had been summoned to meet with the board. I dressed in what I thought was ranch-appropriate attire. A worn denim jacket, boots that had seen better days, and a hat that made me look like I belonged in a Wild West reenactment rather than an HOA hearing. My reflection in the cracked mirror said, "You're about to walk into a lion's den, and the lion has spreadsheets." I arrived at the HOA office. A sterile building that could have doubled as a dentist's office for how cold and clinical it felt. The smell of polished wood and overcooked coffee hit me immediately. And there they were. 5 board members sitting in a row like judges, their expressions smug and superior, each armed with clipboards, pens, and what I could only assume was a lifetime of judging people like me. The chairwoman, a tall woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a stare that could freeze lava, leaned forward. "You're the new owner," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut hay. "And I hope you understand the severity of your violations." I swallowed, trying to appear calm. "Sever what now?" I muttered under my breath. She didn't miss it. $120,000 in fines, that's your total, payable immediately, or we escalate. My jaw dropped. Immediate? Did they think I had that kind of money lying around under the couch cushions? The meeting began. They read out the violations one by one, each one more absurd than the last. Violation 1, unauthorized landscaping modifications. I hadn't touched a single plant. The only modification was a squirrel running across the yard last week. Violation 2, fence maintenance failure. The fence was leaning because it was 40 years old, not because I was lazy. Violation 3, allowing wildlife to roam freely. I looked at the pond, ducks were swimming, frogs were croaking. Was nature now illegal? I tried to respond politely, explaining that I had just inherited the ranch and didn't even know where the property lines ended. But they weren't listening. They had their scripts, and they were sticking to them like glue. The tension in the room was palpable. I could feel my heart racing. But somewhere, deep down, a little spark of humor bubbled up. These people actually think they can scare me with a letter and some fancy suits. I decided to speak up. "Look, I'm new here. I didn't do anything intentionally. I just inherited a ranch. Maybe we can figure this out." The chairwoman's lips curled into a smirk. "Figure this out? The fines are non-negotiable. You will pay or we escalate." I leaned back in my chair, trying to look calm, though my hands were shaking. That's when a thought hit me like a runaway tractor. They have no idea who they're messing with. I forced a smile. "Okay, let's see how far you're willing to take this." And that's when it got interesting. One of the board members, a man with a pencil behind his ear and a permanent frown, leaned in. "We can take legal action immediately. This could cost you more than the fines themselves." I chuckled a little too loudly. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like I just inherited 300 acres of land, a pond full of frogs, and 5 people who need a lesson in humility." The room went silent. I swear I could hear their hearts skip a beat. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was confusion. Or maybe they were just trying to figure out if I was crazy enough to fight back, and I was. By the end of the meeting, the board had made it clear, pay up or face the consequences. But I walked out with a strange mixture of anxiety and excitement. The real fight wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. As I stepped onto the porch of my new ranch, the wind blowing through the fields, I whispered to myself, "They just don't know yet. This is going to get interesting." And I had no idea. The HOA was about to regret picking the wrong owner to bully. After that meeting, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the HOA board's smug faces, their pens tapping like tiny hammers of judgment on their clipboards. $120,000. That number alone was enough to make a person feel like the universe was testing them. I poured myself a cup of coffee that tasted like regret and sat on the porch, staring at the pond. Ducks quacked innocently, oblivious to my new reality. The fence leaned a little more in the morning light, daring me to fight back. And somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, as if agreeing with the HOA's absurdity. I knew one thing, I couldn't let this slide. Not because I had the money to pay, obviously I didn't, but because I couldn't let 5 self-important people decide the fate of my inheritance before I even had a chance to live in it. The first step was research. I went online, reading through the HOA bylaws like a detective hunting for clues. And oh, the absurdities I found. Rule 4, no structure may exceed the height of a mature pine tree. Wait, did that include barns? Because my barn looked like it was trying to reach the clouds. Rule 11, grass must not exceed 3 inches in height between May 1st and November 30th. Grass, 3 inches. I stared at my lawn, which was easily knee-high in some places. Did the HOA really think I was measuring every blade with a ruler? Rule 17, no wildlife interference. I stared at the pond. Frogs, ducks, geese, and that one rabbit I'd seen hopping around the barn last week. Apparently that rabbit was now an enemy of the HOA. I laughed so hard I spilled coffee on my jeans. Honestly, if someone had handed me a list of fines for imaginary crimes, I would have thought it was a prank. But this wasn't a prank. This was their reality. The more I read, the more absurd the whole thing became. Each clause seemed designed to make residents feel guilty for existing. And yet there were loopholes, small, almost laughable, but real. I discovered that many fines had been incorrectly calculated. Some were based on misstated inspections. Others referenced rules that had been amended years ago. Essentially, the HOA was building a $120,000 fantasy bill on a house of cards. I leaned back in my chair thinking, okay, this might just work in my favor. That's when I realized something even better. The HOA didn't know me. They thought they were dealing with a scared, naive ranch owner, someone who would pay up to avoid confrontation, someone who could be bullied into submission. Big mistake. I started imagining the next steps. A plan began to form, one part research, one part patience, and one part strategic chaos. I could see their smug faces already, and I smiled. They wouldn't see it coming. Over the next few days, I walked every inch of the ranch, notebook in hand, jotting down evidence. Crooked fences, fallen branches, wildlife activity, even photos of the barn that proved it had stood there for decades. I documented every potential loophole, every rule the HOA had misapplied. Neighbors started noticing my presence. Some waved, others raised eyebrows. I could hear whispers. "That's the new owner, doesn't seem scared of the HOA." That gave me more energy. If anyone could take on a tyrannical HOA, I thought it was me. One afternoon, I even went to the local library to dig into property records, old HOA meeting minutes, and public notices. The deeper I dug, the more errors I found. Misfiled documents, violations that had expired, and even fines that had been issued to the previous owner and never corrected. It was like discovering a treasure map, except instead of gold, the treasure was proof that the HOA was overreaching, mismanaging, and utterly unprepared for a fight. By the end of the week, I had a folder that could intimidate the entire board. Photos, letters, legal references, and a detailed timeline of how their $120,000 claim didn't hold water. Sitting on the porch that evening, I looked at the pond again. The ducks quacked, as if cheering me on, and I whispered, "Tomorrow, they'll see why picking the wrong owner is the worst mistake of their lives." But deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be easy. The HOA wasn't going to surrender quietly. They were stubborn, prideful, and had a reputation for bullying people into paying fines that didn't exist. Still, I felt a rush of determination, a thrill I hadn't felt in years. This ranch was mine now. And if they thought a $120,000 bill could scare me off, they had another thing coming. I closed my notebook, the weight of the fight settling comfortably on my shoulders. They had started this war, but I was about to show them that some battles aren't won with threats. They're won with patience, strategy, and just the right amount of righteous stubbornness. And as I watched the sun dip behind the hills, I whispered to myself, "Let the games begin." By the next morning, I thought I had a handle on things. I had my evidence, my notes, and a faint glimmer of confidence. I was ready to face the HOA, armed with facts, logic, and an occasional sarcastic comment just in case they needed a little humility lesson. I should have known better. The first sign of trouble came in the form of another envelope. It was stamped in red, bold, and threatening. Final notice, immediate action required. My stomach sank. They had clearly decided that mere letters and polite meetings weren't enough. They wanted to intimidate me. And judging by the smell of smugness that seemed to ooze from the envelope, they were enjoying every second. I opened it, expecting a routine reminder. Instead, I got a list longer than my grocery receipt, filled with violations I didn't even know existed. Violation 23, unauthorized placement of outdoor furniture. I didn't even have furniture outside yet. Violation 29, improper storage of tools. I had a shed full of tools I didn't even know how to use. Violation 37, excessive noise caused by wildlife. Excuse me? The frogs at the pond have been rehearsing their choir for decades. They're not my responsibility. I laughed, but the laugh was nervous. Whoever wrote this clearly thought they were terrifying me, but instead I felt a surge of determination. I knew the next move would be crucial. This wasn't just about paying fines anymore, it was about principle. And principle, as I would soon remind them, is a dangerous thing to underestimate. That afternoon, I decided to confront reality head-on. I marched to the pond, notebook in hand, and began documenting everything. Fallen branches, leaning fences, footprints of wildlife, and even a log that had been washed up along the edge. Every detail mattered. Every piece of evidence was a brick I could use to dismantle their empire of absurdity. While I worked, I couldn't help but notice the neighbors watching. Some waved. Others leaned over fences, whispering and pointing. It felt like I had an audience for my own personal showdown, which added both pressure and motivation. By mid-afternoon, my plan started to take shape. I would need more than just evidence. I needed allies. I started reaching out to a few neighbors who had quietly suffered under the HOA's heavy hand. They were hesitant at first, but once I shared the outrageous fines and the list of violations, eyes widened, jaws dropped, and suddenly I wasn't alone. We formed a small, discreet alliance, a team of ordinary ranch owners who were tired of being bullied. We shared stories, gathered documents, and strategized. Humor became our secret weapon. Violation 23, outdoor furniture, one neighbor joked. Next thing you know, they'll fine us for breathing wrong. We laughed until our sides hurt. It was the kind of camaraderie you only get when you're facing a common enemy that's ridiculously overbearing. But the HOA wasn't going to sit quietly while I built my army. The next morning, my mailbox exploded. Certified letters, notices, threats, and even a notice of a potential legal injunction landed like artillery shells. $120,000 still stared at me like a villain waiting in the shadows. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the mountain of paper, heart racing. Could they really escalate this? Were they ready to drag me into court over imaginary crimes? And if they did, would I survive? I laughed again, a little hysterically this time. "Oh, you want to play this game?" I muttered to myself. "Fine, let's play." I spent the night going through every letter, comparing dates, reviewing bylaws, and marking inconsistencies with bright, almost aggressive highlighter strokes. Each error I found was fuel for the fight ahead. I realized the HOA had made a critical mistake. They assumed fear would make me back down. Instead, it ignited something inside me. Every ridiculous violation, every absurd fine, every smug letter was just another reason to fight harder. By the time the sun rose again, I was ready. I had my evidence organized, my allies on standby, and my resolve as solid as the old barn's foundation. I was no longer just a ranch owner. I was a challenger, and they were about to learn that picking a fight with the wrong person could backfire spectacularly. As I looked out over the fields, the wind tugging at my jacket and the ducks quacking like an audience to my thoughts, I whispered, "They think this is intimidation. They think they can scare me. They're about to find out I don't scare easily." The HOA had struck first, confident and smug, but the battle was far from over. And I had a feeling that the next move, the next confrontation, would be the one that changes everything. By the time the sun rose over Silver Creek Ranch that morning, I knew something had to change. The HOA wasn't going to stop. Certified letters, threats, fines, and over-the-top demands had become a daily ritual. I could almost hear the click of their pens as they plotted my doom from their polished boardroom. But I wasn't going to face this alone anymore. I started with the neighbors. Some had been quiet, others frustrated, and a few had outright disappeared when fines started piling up. I knocked on doors, shared stories, and showed them the absurd letters I had collected. Slowly, reactions shifted from cautious nods to wide-eyed disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," said Mrs. Thompson, a retired teacher whose garden had apparently violated the fence height amendment of 2003. "I've been here 20 years and they've never given me peace." I nodded solemnly. Welcome to my world, but we're not just going to let them bully us. We fight smart. Soon we had a small group forming. Neighbors swapped notes, shared old HOA communications, and even dug up bylaws from years past. Each one uncovered a new error the HOA had made. The more we found, the more confident I felt. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, I wasn't alone, and I had allies who understood just how ridiculous the situation had become. Humor became our secret weapon. Every absurd fine became a joke. Violation 37, excessive wildlife noise, laughed Mr. Jenkins, a burly man with a cowboy hat. Next, they'll fine us for the cows' farts. We laughed until our stomachs hurt, and strangely, it made the fight feel lighter. Ridiculous as the HOA was, it gave us energy to push back. Meanwhile, I started addressing small victories. I wrote polite, detailed letters pointing out errors in their fines and notices. Some were dismissed immediately. Others required brief meetings, during which I presented evidence showing the HOA's mistakes. Each small win felt like a drop of water in a parched desert, but together they were forming a flood that was slowly washing away the HOA's arrogance. The emotional toll was heavy, though. I'd inherited a ranch, yes, but the constant stress, the feeling of being watched, and the endless absurd violations weighed on me. There were moments I wondered if I'd bitten off more than I could chew. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of reviewing fines and organizing evidence, I sat on the porch, staring at the pond. Ducks glided silently across the water, seemingly mocking the seriousness of human rules. I sighed and muttered, "If I survive this, I'm buying that rabbit from the violation letter and throwing it a party." But even in the moments of humor, the stakes were clear. The HOA was relentless, and every move I made was being scrutinized. Every letter, every neighbor meeting, every documented loophole was part of a larger plan to survive, and maybe even turn the tables. One particularly tense moment came when a neighbor whispered that the HOA had begun mentioning potential legal action. My pulse spiked. I knew they were testing me, trying to intimidate me into submission. But I also knew this was the moment I had been preparing for. I spent nights strategizing. I cross-referenced bylaws, verified fines, and compiled evidence into organized files. Every FOD, every old document, every note from previous owners became a weapon in the upcoming showdown. The momentum began to shift subtly. Emails started getting ignored by the HOA when I provided irrefutable evidence. Small fines were overturned. The smugness in their letters seemed to falter slightly. I could almost see it, tiny cracks forming in the facade of their authority. And yet I knew the real battle was still ahead. $120,000 wasn't just a number. It was a threat, a test, and a challenge. The HOA would not give up without a fight. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the fields in gold and shadow, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. My neighbors were counting on me. My ranch was counting on me, and somewhere deep down I realized I was ready to fight. I whispered to the quiet fields, "They think they can bully me, control me, and scare me. They're about to learn that this isn't just a ranch, it's my home, and I don't back down." Tomorrow I knew the next confrontation would escalate. The HOA would strike again, probably with more threats, more absurd fines, and more audacity. But I would be ready. I wasn't just defending a ranch anymore. I was defending my dignity, and that was priceless. The war had only just begun. The morning sunlight poured over Silver Creek Ranch like a spotlight on a stage, and I felt it. This was it. The day the HOA thought they could crush me with a number, $120,000. I had prepared for weeks. Every letter, every bylaw, every misapplied fine carefully documented. My folder was thick enough to make a small fort, and my neighbors were quietly cheering me on from behind fences and hedges. I had allies, evidence, and determination. And most importantly, I had the stubbornness of someone who had just inherited a ranch they weren't going to give up without a fight. The HOA meeting was held in a conference room that smelled like ambition and cheap coffee. I stepped inside, my boots clicking on the tile floor. Across from me, the board sat, smug and confident as ever. They believed they had me cornered. They believed I would fold under the weight of $120,000 and their relentless bullying. The chairwoman leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping on the table. "We're here to settle the matter of your outstanding fines. $120,000, payable immediately." I smiled, though it felt more like a shield than joy. "Let's go through the list, shall we?" I opened my folder, flipping to the first violation. Violation 1, unauthorized landscaping. According to your own records, no inspection has been conducted in over 5 years. Furthermore, this property was grandfathered in under previous bylaws. This fine is invalid. A slight pause. I could see the edges of their confidence crack ever so slightly. Violation 11, grass exceeding 3 inches, I continued. Your measurement was taken on June 2nd, which is 1 day outside the specified compliance window according to the 2015 amendment. By your own rules, this fine should not exist. I glanced around. The smug faces were beginning to falter. One member whispered to another. The chairwoman's pen paused mid-tap, as if unsure whether to attack or defend. I pressed on. Violation 37, excessive wildlife noise. I understand the HOA has concerns about property tranquility. However, your bylaws do not regulate natural wildlife. Frogs croaking, ducks quacking, rabbits hopping, not my responsibility. Therefore, this fine is baseless. The room grew tense. I could practically see their minds racing, trying to figure out how someone so ordinary could dismantle their carefully constructed fantasy of authority. Then came my secret weapon, the historical violations. I slid a set of documents across the table. Here are records showing previous fines issued under similar circumstances that were dismissed or overturned. If the board continues to insist on $120,000, you're contradicting your own precedent. The chairwoman's lips tightened. I could see her trying to maintain control, but her glare had lost some of its venom. Confidence was slipping. Humor kept creeping into my mind, though I fought to stay composed. $120,000. They must think they're scary. Cute. I leaned back and let silence fill the room. It was heavy, electric, charged with the tension of a battle fought with words, evidence, and patience rather than fists. Every eye was on me. I could feel their frustration simmering, their panic growing. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected me to show up armed with research, facts, and an unshakable refusal to be bullied. Finally, the chairwoman spoke, her voice a mixture of irritation and disbelief. This doesn't make sense. How did you?" I smiled faintly. "It's called reading, preparation, and not letting people intimidate you with numbers on a page. $120,000 isn't just a fine, it's an idea, and I refuse to let an idea scare me out of my own ranch." Another board member muttered something about legal action, but I was ready for that too. "Proceed if you wish," I said calmly, "but be prepared for a counterclaim. Every baseless fine, every misapplied violation, every intimidation tactic is documented. I've built a case strong enough to withstand it all." The tension in the room was palpable. They wanted me to crack. They wanted me to flinch. But instead, I sat there calm, collected, and ready. And in that moment, I realized the fight wasn't just about money. It was about proving that sometimes the most unexpected person, armed with patience, intelligence, and persistence, could stand up to authority. By the time the meeting ended, I walked out feeling victorious, even though the final word hadn't been spoken. They were rattled. They hadn't won. And more importantly, I had shown them that I wasn't someone who could be pushed around. Outside, the sun was setting over the ranch, painting everything in golden light. I looked at the fields, the pond, the crooked fences, and whispered, "They thought $120,000 would scare me. They were wrong." This was the beginning of the end for the HOA's little empire of absurd fines. And I had a feeling the next time we met, the balance of power would tip even further. Little did they know the final twist, the part that would truly humiliate them, was coming, and I couldn't wait to see it. The days after the $120 case showdown felt like a calm before a storm, but I knew better. The HOA wasn't going to quietly slink away, embarrassed and defeated. They were prideful, stubborn, and convinced that money and authority could intimidate anyone. But I had a secret they couldn't see: patience, preparation, and an unshakable determination to win. I spent the next few nights reviewing my folder of evidence, looking for any weak points the HOA might exploit. Every letter, every bylaw, every previous violation became part of a strategy that was more than just defensive. It was offensive. I wasn't just proving them wrong. I was preparing to humiliate them, legally and morally. The next board meeting was scheduled for mid-morning. I arrived early, letting the sunlight hit the ranch first. There was power in showing confidence, even when inside, my heart was pounding like a drum in a parade. I carried my folder like a shield and maybe, just maybe, like a sword. Inside the conference room, the board's smugness was palpable. The chairwoman shot me a look that could curdle milk. "Back again," she said, voice dripping with irritation. "Do you think another meeting will change anything?" I smiled faintly, letting the words hang in the air. "Actually, I do, because this time I've done my homework, and I think you'll find the homework a little uncomfortable." I began systematically dismantling their claims. Every violation I had previously challenged. I presented documented evidence that not only invalidated it, but exposed the HOA's mismanagement. Violation 1, landscaping, I said, sliding a photograph across the table. This inspection was never properly filed. Your own records show a missing date and signature. According to HOA rules, this fine is null and void. A ripple of panic spread across the table. I could see it in their eyes, tiny cracks of doubt forming. Next, I presented a timeline of previous fines, showing inconsistencies, expired violations, and repeated errors. Every smile on my face was a silent hammer striking the foundation of their authority. Violation 37, wildlife noise, I continued, placing another folder on the table. Your regulations do not cover natural wildlife. Frogs, ducks, and rabbits cannot be fined for existing. Attempting to do so is not just absurd, it's unlawful. The chairwoman leaned back, her perfect posture faltering. One board member whispered frantically to another. I imagined the panic as a storm cloud rolling over their heads. They had thought $120,000 would scare me. Instead, I had armed myself with evidence sharp enough to pierce their ego. Then came the piece de resistance. I pulled out a stack of official documents, emails, and meeting minutes showing that the HOA had repeatedly misapplied rules and issued fines without proper authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said calmly, letting each word land like a hammer, "by continuing to insist on these fines, you are not only breaking your own rules but exposing yourselves to legal liability. Your intimidation tactics are documented, and you are now accountable." I could see it, the confusion, the anger, the fear. The smug facade was cracking, and I was the earthquake. The room grew tense, silent except for the faint rustle of papers. The chairwoman's lips tightened into a line I would later describe to neighbors as the human equivalent of a lightning strike. She began, voice wavering. I smiled. "I can, and I just did. Your $120,000 threat. Gone. Every fine, every violation, every ridiculous claim, invalid. And if you continue to harass me or my neighbors, I have documented everything, and the legal consequences will be yours." A beat of silence, then another. Then, finally, a resigned nod from the youngest board member, who looked like he had been dragged into a hurricane he couldn't survive. Outside, I could feel the tension evaporate like morning fog. The HOA had underestimated me, thought they could scare me into submission, and had failed spectacularly. As I left the building, I whispered to myself, half in disbelief, half in triumph, they picked the wrong owner. The wrong one to intimidate, the wrong one to bully, the wrong one to mess with. Back at the ranch, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. Ducks quacked softly, and the wind rustled the leaves as if celebrating the victory. Neighbors waved from afar, their smiles wide and relieved. I sat on the porch, sipping a well-earned cup of coffee, the chaos of the HOA still lingering but powerless. For the first time in weeks, I felt pure, unadulterated satisfaction. Not just because I had won, but because I had done it with patience, preparation, and persistence. And somewhere deep inside, I knew one truth would echo for a long time. The HOA would never forget the day they met the wrong ranch owner. But even as I celebrated, I couldn't shake a thought. They were stubborn, and some part of me knew this wasn't over. The next move would be theirs, and if history taught me anything, they would try something desperate. I smiled, setting down my coffee. Let them try. Because this time, I was ready for anything. The days after my victory over the HOA felt surreal. The $120,000 fines had been dropped, my neighbors were quietly cheering from their porches, and the ranch finally felt like mine. But the most satisfying part, watching the HOA scramble like they'd just been hit by a hurricane they never saw coming. I spent the first morning after the showdown walking the property, boots sinking slightly in the damp earth, the wind rustling through the grass, and the ducks quacking as if applauding my efforts. I couldn't help but laugh. After weeks of stress, threats, and absurdity, it felt like the ranch itself was celebrating. Neighbors stopped by, offering congratulations, baked goods, and even homemade signs. Long live the ranch owner who doesn't take HOA nonsense. It was touching, hilarious, and slightly surreal. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Of course, life with an HOA-free ranch wasn't suddenly perfect. The barn still leaned, the fences still sagged, and the pond remained murky. But somehow those imperfections felt like a badge of honor now. Every crooked fence post, every wild animal roaming freely was a reminder that I had survived. I had won. I even started small renovations. I fixed the barn door that had hung crookedly for decades. I patched up the fence. I planted wildflowers, bright and untamed, because after everything, I deserved something that was truly mine. And as I worked, I laughed at the thought. I bet the HOA would have fined me for planting flowers in the wrong pattern. Emails and letters from the HOA slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely. Apparently, they were licking their wounds and figuring out how they had been outsmarted by a single ranch owner armed with patience, research, and persistence. Their threats, once looming like dark clouds over Silver Creek Ranch, had vanished. I spent some time reflecting on the fight. It wasn't just about money or fines. It was about dignity, fairness, and proving that bullies don't always win. Every absurd rule, every ridiculous fine, every condescending meeting had tested me. But it also taught me something invaluable. Standing up for yourself isn't just about confrontation. It's about preparation, patience, and knowing your worth. Humor had carried me through the worst moments. I chuckled remembering the $120,000 list of violations that included excessive wildlife noise. Frogs, ducks, and rabbits, the three most innocent defendants imaginable, had unknowingly been my allies in this battle. Even the neighbors had gotten a little taste of joy from my antics. "I never thought I'd see someone argue with the HOA over a rabbit and win," said Mr. Jenkins with a grin. "You're a legend now." And maybe I was, but in truth, it wasn't just about me. It was about the ranch, the community, and the principle that no one should be bullied into paying for absurd rules they never agreed to. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the pond as the sun dipped behind the hills. The ducks glided across the water, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. Silver Creek Ranch wasn't just inherited property anymore. It was mine, in every sense of the word. I whispered to the quiet fields, "We did it. We survived the fines, the threats, the absurdities, and we won." In that moment, I realized the battle with the HOA had changed me. I wasn't just a ranch owner. I was someone who could stand up to authority, challenge the ridiculous, and emerge victorious. I felt stronger, more confident, and ready for whatever life threw my way. Of course, I still kept a folder of evidence tucked safely in the office, just in case. Some lessons are too good not to remember. And as night fell, I thought about the future. Wildflowers blooming, fences standing tall, ducks quacking freely, and me finally calling this ranch my home. I laughed softly, thinking they picked the wrong owner and I picked the right fight. Silver Creek Ranch was mine. The HOA had learned their lesson. And I had inherited more than property. I had inherited pride, victory, and a story worth telling. As I sipped the last of my coffee, I smiled and whispered, "Next time anyone tries to mess with me, they'll remember this ranch and me." The ducks quacked in agreement, and I knew, finally, it was over. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.